Hello and welcome to The Found Cause. We have found our cause in serving the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my virtual front is...
Sebastian, the curator.
It's been a while since we met and posted an episode. I think it's been 2 weeks by the time this airs. Our previous episode did decent for Found Cause standards, and so this one will probably not, but who knows? I'll say this is a Theodore topic that Theodore is not present for, which is normal. He's our ideator. So forgive us if this is not exactly what you wanted, Theodore, but we're going to be talking about Marxism today, which, if you are unfamiliar with Marxism as a word, it's communism, which surely you're familiar with. Sebastian, you have done a series of lectures to your youth at church on different economic theories and how they relate to Christianity. So I'm going to be leaning on you to be our bookman here. But the basic idea, we don't want to become, we're not a political podcast, and so this isn't just like pure PragerU politics or something bland like that. We'd like to connect, give Marxism and communism a steel-manned approach, especially approaching it from Christians who advocate for such philosophies, but also taking like a general look at what are, if you encounter communists in the wild, they're probably not Christians. How do we handle it? How do we handle it gracefully without just like drawing classic party lines of you are communist and therefore you are evil or the opposite? But how do we approach Marxism as a philosophy like we do any other from a biblical world lens? So there will probably be things that we endorse that you would be shocked by because, you know, communism equals bad in classic American culture. But yeah, spoiler alert, Marxism is diametrically opposed to religious, or it doesn't have to be diametrically opposed to religion, but it is diametrically opposed to God's law. And we are avid advocates of God's law. So that's the spoiler. But without further ado, Sebastian, you can give a primer if you'd like, but how would you define Marxism?
Yep. I would say, as we discussed before this started, that we need to understand the lens that, before we even define communism, how it sees the world, and then we'll get to the definition. What I drove to my class was they need to understand dialectical materialism. That is the lens in which Marxists, communists, socialists see the world. And these are all different branches of a similar ideology. In essence, you see the word materialism. They believe that what really matters in this world is the material, the physical world. I mean, I guess that's part of what Christianity is about, acknowledging the physicality of the world. But then they reject the spiritual, which is, never mind, we're out of here. Already missed the boat on that one. Okay. The physical world is truly what matters, and specifically economic issues are what is the driving force behind social struggle, conflict, war, politics, physical economic means. So that's the lens that they see it, and dialectical implies conflict. So in other words, communism sees the world through class struggle. And what does that mean? Since antiquity, since human society has organized in their worldview, there are those who have power and wealth and those who don't. And the ones who have power and wealth use that power and wealth to oppress, take advantage of, whatever word you want to use, on those who don't have anything. And that has been the root cause of conflict throughout human history, said Marx in his little red book. Really good read, by the way. He writes very well. Say whatever you want about his ideas, but he knew how to write. And finally, what's the pinnacle of this class struggle that he despises? Capitalism. We're not going to dive too much into capitalism. We may do an episode. No, if this does well, we should do an episode. Then is capitalism in line with Christianity? We'll get to that. So, so now that we have that worldview, dialectical materialism, the end goal of communism, Marxism, is the root of this evil of struggle, and that's the abolition of private property. Private property would be, in short, the means of creating capital and profit. Could be a business, could be the farm in your backyard that you're using to sell what extra produce you have beyond what you need to sustain yourself, and making money or obtaining some sort of benefit that you wouldn't get if you were just sustaining it for yourself. That's private property. So the end goal of Marxism is the abolition of such private property to create a more equal society in which the class of the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, no longer oppress or take advantage of the workers, the proletariat. This could be done in many ways. It could be done democratically. There's some democratic socialists who advocate for this. You can gently transition to Marxism, socialism. And there are those, more traditionally, say, nope, we don't have time for this. We're going to get to communism right now. Let's overthrow everything. Long live the revolution. You have Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, and friends. So they differ on how to... Marx never said, kill everybody to get to Marxism or communism. He just said, we should get there somehow. How you get there is up to you.
Well, and for the sake of steelmanning, why do you think this is such a popular philosophy? Because clearly it is. It's for those who want a tiny history lesson. It was from the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s is when Karl Marx lived in Germany, and then he was exiled and lived in the UK for a while. And so why, a lot of philosophies have lived and died since then. Why is communism remained?
Because you see today and back then inequality between people. You see that there are people who live very opulent lives, millionaires who have mansions, multiple cars, private jets, and then the people that work for them at let's just say an Amazon warehouse, they don't have anything anywhere close to that. So the idea of them being exploited by their employer is an attractive idea, because you feel like the work that you're putting in is not reflected in what you earn. That's why these ideas are attractive to people.
I would agree. I think the main hook of communism is not the hope that it gives, but rather the stoking of envy that you're like, yeah, that's true, and I don't like the way things are now. So it's more of a things aren't good now versus a utopian view. However, I mean, classically, there is a utopia at the end of Marxism. What does a utopian Marxist world look like? What's their heaven?
Yep. That labor, whatever that looks like, you could be an artist, you could be a factory worker, you could be a shoemaker, you could be a painter. Your labor should enrich the worker, not someone else. You should be the main owner of what you produce. And so that's part of their heaven, their utopia. And work should not be used to promote capital, mainly money, or even create more labor just for the sake of growing in wealth. Private property are done away with, and everything is social, meaning community owned, and everything is collectivized. So property is owned by all members of society, and people have all their needs met equally. If someone has an emergency, that's okay. People are more than happy to give of what they have for the sake of the other person, which sounds wonderful, I would say. That sounds pretty generous, right?
Yeah, and the way I hear it pitched, it may be slightly updated to modern times, but people who advocate for a universal basic income for many excuses, one of them being AI right now, but it was proposed before AI was a thing too, is that eventually there'll be no work for us to do, and so we need to give everyone a basic level of money or living or value to work. And the freedom of this, the benefit of not having to work, is having infinite optionality. And I think that's the draw of the Marxist utopia, is that on any given day you can do whatever you want. All work is voluntary, and you still can eat and drink and consume as much as you want. So if you want to consume infinite wine, if you were to consume gallons and gallons and gallons of wine, the wine is available to you, and it's easy to get, and you can get it in your house, and you can drink as much as you want. And likewise, if you want to travel to Venus, I guess there's rockets for you because you got to have infinite things you can do. And so it is infinite material abundance is the promise of the utopia. And so you can do whatever you want because you'll never be wanting for more. There's always infinite things to you. So like you had already said, it's a very material view of the world, i.e., everyone would be happy if they just had access to whatever they wanted to do materially.
Mm-hmm. And that's how they would define happiness. So you have all your basic needs met. I am speaking, still from the 1800s from Marx, because you're bringing up examples from spaceships and having infinite amount of wine. I think that they would have been okay with, okay, our country has limited resources. We're content with just having enough to eat day by day, having a house, maybe a means of transportation. But yes, ultimately, the utopia is a paradise on earth, I would say.
And I think this is where the image starts to break down in that if you cap, well, I don't know. Is there anything more we should say about Marxism as an object before we get into the flaws?
I think we have discussed the end goals, how it came up. They saw great inequality and they figured out, and poverty, and they thought that was evil, and they have that right. It's not good to oppress people. I mean, that is consistent with Scripture. Mm-hmm. God speaks out against those with power exploiting others, so that is good. Work should have its own dignity. That's probably godly. And
don't muzzle the ox as it treadeth about the corn. It's a King James version of the law in Leviticus, and that is the laborer should be worthy of his wages, as Paul would say it. Like if you work, you should eat from that labor. So that's in line with that as well. If we're talking about God's law.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and also on a note of steel manning, many people misunderstand communism, thinking that the government is going to take everything from you. That's not really true. When Marx, Lenin, and friends say that they want to abolish private property, they don't mean personal property. So like your clothes, what you need for your sustenance, that's defined as being personal. Even your car. When it crosses that line, I think I already mentioned, is when you make profit from whatever object, possession, or person that's close to you that you use to make you make revenue from.
Which is a very confusing line because classically communists aren't big fans of giant mansions, right? Because it would show that if you have a mansion and somebody doesn't have a mansion, you must have exploited somebody in your life to get there, and probably a lot of people, because a mansion's pretty far away from like a humble hovel. And so although the mansion is personal property, it's ill-gotten gains, and so it needs to be destroyed, redistributed, whatever. But if you have the baseline, clothing, food, housing, that is yours to keep. So you will, as the world, I'm going to say the wrong domineering Swiss organization, but as the New World Order classic groups would say, you will own nothing and be happy. You'll kind of own a base level of clothing and food and housing that we won't take from you, but you can't have more.
It varied, and people in the Soviet Union, they lived pretty normal lives. It wasn't, like sub-Saharan Africa types of poverty, definitely not even close. But yeah, you just couldn't be rich. You just couldn't have an extravagant life, definitely. So that is limiting. That's something that it definitely limits.
Which so the utopia vision is that like once we've redistributed all wealth and people are free to do whatever they want, like human ingenuity unlocks, and suddenly people, because they aren't starving or thinking about where they're going to get their next meal or put a roof over their head, they're suddenly like free to do creative, beautiful things, and so they're inventing things we've never had before, and like wealth becomes and it's shared. As soon as they invent it, it's shared across all of society, and now we're all making the new gizmo gadget or the spaceship that goes to Venus, and so it's again infinite material wealth. I think as you are already getting into the practical history of Marxism is one that you can't really avoid. So like we've given the philosophy and the goal, but the getting there is pretty important too, which is why Marxism in and of itself, plain old Marxism, is not really a practical philosophy because it doesn't have effective means of achieving this society. And that's why there's all different flavors, like you were already mentioning, of ways to get to the society. And you were telling me before we aired that the most popular one is Leninism, based on the Soviet Union, the most famous communist country.
Yes, Marxist-Leninism. Lenin said he's pretty much, let's call him a founding father. He's what George Washington is to the U.S., but to the Soviet Union, I would say. Yeah, his body is encased in glass in Russia, so you can go there right now if you want. Very strange relic to keep of someone. Kind of ironic, to idolize someone that hated religion. But we'll get to that. So yes, the practicality of Marxism is, okay, you take over the country, now what do you do? How do you redistribute this stuff? How do you go about making sure everyone is paid not necessarily perfectly equal, but more or less an equal wage? And rules were set in which a factory manager would not be paid exponentially more than the base worker at the factory. So it was a greater wage because you have more responsibility. That was the logic. But it's not going to be like how some CEOs make 20 times more than what the janitor makes at a company, at a business in the US.
So you can tell it's already compromising on baseline Marxism in that. And why? Why, might I ask? Pray tell, why would they be compromising? Because Lenin initially, and like as all great experiments go, I don't think planned to make these kind of compromises.
No, they wanted to abolish money. They couldn't, so they brought money back.
Why not? Why couldn't they abolish money?
Because of human nature.
Yeah. Yes, that's all I'm getting at. For those who are uninitiated, I'm sure you've heard something about communism, or at least even if you are a communist, you've heard these arguments that if you ask people to work for free, they will not work. They may work a little, but they're not going to work enough. And so if you give everybody the exact same wage, regardless of whether or not they work, nobody or too few people are going to take the difficult, hard jobs. And so difficult, hard jobs, by very human nature, need to receive more payment for them. Otherwise, people won't do them. Yeah. So that's the history of the Soviet Union, is that they make these compromises because people weren't doing the jobs that were needed to be doing, like managing, which is not always fun. It's harder than being a regular old line worker. Or and they also experimented with conscription of like, oh yeah, nobody wants to work in the coal mines, right? They'd much rather be a clerk at a convenience store. And so, but we need coal because we need electricity, because that's a part of the standard of living that we want to upkeep. So we're going to force everybody to have a time in the coal mine because we'll do it equally. We'll have everybody in this town that produces coal go into the coal mines, but everybody's got to do some coal mining work, which one is, bad because people that for a variety of reasons might not have been fit for the coal mines were put into the coal mine. There also is the huge possibility of corruption in conscription systems like that, where somebody is able to evade the conscription police because they pay somebody off or they just run away. And then likewise, there's going to be some necessary inequality in who can go coal mining, because weak elderly people or women in general probably aren't going to be the best coal miners, or children are not going to be coal miners. And so all of those things prevent the equal society that is trying to be tried. So at every step, actually implementing a fully equal society is pretty much impossible because of all of these reasons. And so they didn't keep conscripting people to work in the coal mines, except for their massive slave labor system of political prisoners. But normally, like you're saying, Sebastian, pay a little bit more to do the harder job.
Yeah, that's a big compromise. That's definitely already deviating from core ideological Marxism, because I thought it was all about getting rid of free trade, money, wage, and you're already compromising. That's a pretty big change. And what if practically? Oh yeah, on the practical sense. Now that you mentioned conscription, yes, it was illegal not to work in the Soviet Union. So if you were a homeless person, children yearn for the mines, so you're going coal mining. You are a prisoner, can't have you idling by in jail, going to the fields to plow some wheat. You don't want to. You have your farm that you're using to sell it. They call them kulaks. It's like people that grab their fists like this, and because they were hoarders. Hoarders, I think that's a better rendition in English. It's like, nope, we're collectivizing the farms. We're all working together, everybody.
Well, and I might point out the obvious. The practical result of this kind of forcing you to work because goods need to be produced in order to keep a certain standard of living inside of society means that instead of the Marxist utopia, things actually got much worse under Marxism as far as the Marxist goal than they were under whatever system was there before, because the goal of making man free of being forced to do anything, you can pick whatever job you want and material is plenty. Instead, the Soviet Union got ridiculously poorer because they were putting people who are worse at their jobs doing things they didn't normally do, like coal mining or farming. And then in the same time, people were forced to do things they never wanted to do. They'd much rather be doing some other job that was perfectly legitimate, but they were forced to go to the mines, go farm, do whatever the state thought was best for society, even if it wasn't best for that person. And so personal freedom and enjoyment obviously plummeted because of this. Slave labor vastly increased. The rate of death for these laborers vastly increased because the state was at the very least inexperienced at managing these kind of indentures. If not, they were purposely making them death trap kind of things because they wanted to rid themselves of undesirable people. And overall wealth decreased. So really a failure on all fronts, this kind of implementation. And maybe you're of the opinion that it needs to get worse before it gets better, that this is a necessary step towards utopia, for a dip in freedom and standard living, and then the engine will kick in and we will be even greater than our forefathers.
Yeah, that's what they believe. Definitely, during the revolution was an absolute clown show. It was. You would not want to be there during that that transition periods, flipping back and forth between no money, no currency, capitalism, some trade, no trade. You can imagine the chaos that brings. But then by the time, what's his face, Brezhnev, the guy with the very large eyebrows, the people in the Soviet Union were content. Like people that had lived as medieval peasants were now living okay, yes. Did you have to work in a collectivized farm? Sure. But you're no longer a medieval peasant. So if you lived through that, the revolution, if you survived, your standard of living was objectively better than before the revolution. Catch is, you need to survive that. You need not to starve. And you need not to be sent to a gulag. So if you lived through all of that, people were content until the fall of the Soviet Union. So it was a way to run society for them, but at a big, big cost. And this is at least what I find interesting. If I can talk about the education and spiritual aspect of communism and how it was implemented. And again, sorry if you think, oh my gosh, we should be talking about North Korea, Vietnam, China. Soviet Union is easy to talk about because it collapsed and a lot of facts are accessible. So that's why I refer often to the Soviet Union. In Marxism and Leninism, education was to be done by the society. That's straight from this red book. And the state should be in essence, the state should be the one doing public education. What does that mean for churches, you may ask? Because there were a lot of Baptists, Lutherans, and other Christian denominations in Russia during the revolution and after. You had to enroll your children in public school, and you could not have a private school. You can see where this is going. churches were forbidden from teaching other than just carrying out services. And we'll talk about religion in a bit too. The concept of the family was meant to be recreated because the wives were oppressed and they need to be liberated. So that's where you get the idea of civil marriage. Lenin, fun fact, he legalized gay marriage because, he says, if the classical understanding of marriage is created by the capitalists and those crazy religious people that use it to oppress the poor, we should allow all forms of marriage. So gay marriage was legalized. And the goal for communism, Marxism, was to have all nations and borders erased. Why? Because nations are an artificial creation by the bourgeoisie. So that's why you have communist countries helping each other so much during the Cold War. People from communist Czechoslovakia and Poland would send resources to North Korea when they were having the famine because they're friends, to help each other. All communists are not just nations. We are brothers and sisters united in a common cause to liberate humanity. So I guess that's nice. Now, religion. That's really what interested me from this topic. I'll read a quote from Lenin on socialism and religion. This was published in, 1905. Novaya Жизнь, which means new life in Russian. Those who toil and live in want all their lives are taught by religion to be submissive and patient while on earth, and to take comfort in the hope of a heavenly reward. But those who live by the labor of others are taught by religion to practice charity while on earth, thus offering them a very cheap way of justifying their entire existence as exploiters and selling them at a moderate price ticket to well-being in heaven. Religion is opium for the people. Religion is a sort of spiritual booze in which the slaves of capital drown their human image, their demand for a life more or less worthy of man. That's from Lenin. He quotes Marx in that religion is the opium of the people. Now, many debate what Marx meant by that. He is dismissive of religion. It's like, I don't really want to talk about religion in one part of the manifesto because it's like, this silly nonsense. But he doesn't say destroy religion. Lenin understood Marx to say, okay, atheism is the pinnacle of human intellect, and only dumb people are religious. So what he would say. What we get from this passage is that religion came into existence in human society as a tool for those with power and to either oppress the serfs, the slaves that worked for them, or as a coping mechanism for all these poor laborers, these poor serfs that could never hope to have any better outcome of their lives here on earth with the promise of an afterlife. They'll be so much better in heaven. You can be poor and stinky and live in a sad hut and work for the land, for your landlord, but it's okay. The Lord will reward you in heaven. That's how it would be phrased. And then for those who have power and wealth, those rich CEOs, religion is a nice mechanism to make themselves feel better by just giving a few hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is nothing compared to all the millions that they may have, and just get some morality points, either in their religion or in their minds, and feel better about themselves. That's why he says religion is opium for the people. It's a coping mechanism. What does this mean in practice? In the Soviet Union, it was illegal to have your religion displayed in public. If you wanted to work for the state, you had to be atheist, because only dumb people are religious. If you want to work for the party, the Grand Communist Party, you need to be atheist. That's how you demonstrate your intelligence. And then what about all the dumb people, quote unquote dumb people, that live in this wonderful Soviet Union? Oh yeah, they can have religion. It's private now. It's an internal matter that they keep to themselves. They cannot proselytize. And they cannot teach about their religion in Sunday school. So just do worship services. You need to have your sermon approved by the local commissar or city council. and you need a license. Oh yes, the license. Because all the land in the Soviet Union is owned by the people, and thus the Communist Party and thus the state, you are a social club, and therefore you need permission to occupy a building, in this case your church, which now belongs to the Communist Party. And you need to constantly renew your permit to inhabit in said social club that you call a church. What would happen is some commissars would be zealously atheist. This happened mostly this happened a lot in Muslim regions where they had the mosques had to renew their permits. They say, "Whoops, sorry, you had to renew your permit 2 weeks ago, even though that's not what it said on a piece of paper. I guess you can't enter that mosque anymore. Bye." Or, "Whoops, sorry, we lost your permit to inhabit this church. I guess we're going to turn this into a gymnasium. Let's say turn a Lutheran church in Moscow into a private, a pool, a club for swimming." Were they going in guns blazing, killing all Christians that they saw in the Soviet Union? No. They did in the revolution. They did it to the Orthodox Church because, unfortunately, they had their domes in the churches covered in solid gold. Probably a really bad idea to have to begin with. And also, you're just a target for some crazy radicals that are looking to overthrow the nation and need money to start the government. So that happened. That's bad. And then, Christians, they lived. They evangelized. They met in secret. Because obviously, if you have a sermon that preaches against what the Soviet government is doing, then it's not going to get approved. So you're not going to openly preach out something that the government needs to hear, which is a Christian calling. Like sometimes you have to preach to your leaders to tell them, by the way, what you're doing is sin, so please don't do that. They did not want that to happen.
Yeah, and that's 32 minutes. I hope that if you are a communist or communist inclined, or you're just curious listening, that you realize we gave a pretty strong time period length of this episode to giving communism its day in the sun. So we gave them pure philosophy, Marxism, hopefully with not too much color against it, and then the history of the Soviet Union, hopefully a little kinder than a normal history take on it would be. We're not, and you could get into a lot more. Clearly, there's lots of history around the Soviet Union. We can talk about why it collapsed and all the rest. We talked about a couple of the reasons why they compromised on certain things, but that would be way too long. And I really want to get into the biblical comparison as we promised. So let's start talking about how does Marxism compare to the Bible. We already talked about some of the alignments. So clearly, the religious atheism, secularism of Leninism is not in alignment with God or with religion in general, and we are called to spread the word, make disciples. Lenin is saying you cannot. Clearly, those are at odds. So I would say no Christian, and I don't even think they really advocate, but no Christian, socialist, Christian advocate of communism is a Leninist in that they don't believe the way to a better society is abolishing God, obviously. So that right out of the gate is not compatible. However, if we remove the secularism fervor from communism, what does align? And a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but it's not an uncommon thing to say, for somebody to say like, oh, socialism or a form of Marxism is good because of God's law, and we just keep the secularism part out of it, or keep certain other undesirable parts out of Marxism. But like the core of Marxism is a good, godly thing. We already mentioned some of the alignments are that a laborer is worthy of his wages. So the pieces of the manifesto that do align with that's in line. The Bible obviously has lots of oppressor versus oppressed motifs, themes inside of it. The Proverbs and Jesus and the prophets from God and God himself through the prophets are talking about rescuing the oppressed from the oppressor, and that God does this. Several of the Psalms use that language explicitly, that God rescues the oppressed and humbles the mighty, humbles the proud, humbles the rich. And so that motif that there is an oppressor and oppressed class happening on the earth is definitely in line with things that God has said and themes of the Bible. Jesus, of course, famously says it's easier for a rich man to fit through, or for a camel to fit through an eye needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. So that's a general condemnation of being rich. However, not rich that is in our day, it was rich back then, and so comparative richness is a bad thing. And then in the same way, Paul writes that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and so surely that is in line with communism as well. They don't love wealth. So what else? The most famous is probably Acts 6 or whatever. All the people in the early church, they share all things in common, and they sell all their land, and as people need it, they give them food and whatever they need, and that no one was wanting. That's a line from the first early church. That is probably the impetus for any layman church person who's reading through to say, whoa, maybe if the early church was doing things this way, that sounds pretty communist, that everybody shared all things in common. It's even in the word. They're selling all their land. Isn't that what we should be doing? We should no longer own private property. We should all live and work communally. Am I missing anything here, Sebastian?
And the Lord loves a cheerful giver from 2 Corinthians 9. So hold things in common and don't hesitate to give whatever thing you have to those in need.
So in all those ways, you might say, okay, so there's a lot here aligned in communism. We shouldn't own private property because the early church was doing this, and they were selling all their stuff and giving to those in need. So even if there were times in the Bible where people own private property, at least in the new kingdom of Christ, we shouldn't own private property, and we shouldn't accumulate wealth of any sort, because the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and rich people can't get to heaven, or at least it's very difficult for them, and therefore we shouldn't make money, and any money we do make, we should be redistributing to at least fellow Christians, if not others. That's, I mean, is there more to it than that before we go to other verses?
If we miss anything, comment down below. We'd love to hear the comments.
And I will also say a common rebuke of communist tendencies from Christians that I would say is kind of an unfair and cliche attack. And so I will disarm this one too, is when Jesus says, when Judas and the disciples complain that Mary Magdalene comes and breaks an expensive jar of nard and uses it to clean his feet, and they say, this could have been sold and for a great deal and given to the poor, says Judas, who also wanted to steal some of the money on the side. And Jesus's response is, the poor will always be with you, but I am not always with you. I think some of that does attack communism in that Jesus doesn't agree. He doesn't say, yes, the ultimate good is that we sell everything we make that we don't need and give it to the poor. So in that way, like, checkmate atheist, checkmate Karl Marx, Jesus there rejects a core tenet that this personal property of Mary's did not actually need to be sold and given to the poor. Maybe there's an exception for Jesus Christ, right? But I think the way that's normally used is to say, Jesus says the poor will always be with you, and therefore the eradication of poverty is a futile thing. We should not try to eradicate poverty. I think that's an unfair... I don't think that's what Jesus is actually trying to say. I think he's saying, like, this would not have alleviated... But the nard would not have alleviated poverty. This is a special thing for me. I am not always here with you, so let the woman be at peace. I think that's really what he's saying. So I don't think he's making a blanket statement that poverty will always exist. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, no. And you could even say he's just making an observation. It's like saying, and sin will remain in the world. Well, yes, it will until all heavens and the new earth are made. I mean, it sounds like he's just stating a fact, not necessarily he's making a claim. Oh, therefore, let poverty exist. I think we might be reading too much into the text if we jump to that conclusion.
I'll also say, if we're into the like force you to work model, which is getting a little bit beyond Marxism and into Leninism, Paul explicitly says that the church is only to provide for widows, i.e. people who would not have been able to make a living on their own, not able to work. So this already starts to color what the early church was doing for each other. You wonder, who they were providing for when they sold land. And if you read the text, when they sell land, they sell it as people need. So they don't all sell all of their land all at once because they are rebuking the ownership of private property. Instead, they're selling it as they need because they're supplying for those who are in need. And the only people in need, as Paul qualifies, are people who cannot earn a living for themselves. So I think in these modern days, I think we have a higher proportion of people who are mentally handicapped than they would have had back then, just purely based on survival rates after birth. And so we recognize in society today that there are people who are unable to sustain themselves because of their either physical or mental incapacity. And not the soft stuff, not the I'm too anxious to go outside, but the like born with a birth defect, unable to do valuable work. We all recognize that those kinds of people require support if they're going to live. And so in the same way, Paul recognizes, and therefore God, the Word of God, recognizes that there are widows who are too old or they do too invaluable of work to actually support themselves. And so when their husband is gone, they need to be supported. So in that way, Paul recognizes that a subset of people do need support, subsistence, subsidies from fellow Christians, but he forbids the subsidizing of widows that are under a certain age, i.e., if they're under a certain age, they can probably be doing some decently valuable work that they could sustain themselves. They should not be getting any stipend from the church. And in the same way, he forbids even older widows who themselves cannot sustain themselves from getting support from the church if they have a family who ought to be paying for them. In this way, he's hearkening back to God's law, which says honor the father and mother and like respect your family, mainly the honor your father and mother commandment of the Ten Commandments, in that if your mother is wasting away, literally going to die because she doesn't have enough money, obviously you should be supporting her. And for the church to intervene and prevent you from fulfilling the law of God, it would actually be an evil thing. And so in this way, we already start to see a separation, even from like, we're not even going to the core text that I think talk against communism. We're seeing a separation from Marxist philosophy and Christian philosophy, and that is that it is not the duty of the public, or even if we confine the public to just Christians, it's not the duty of all Christians to support every other Christian. It's actually first and foremost the family to support the family, and then Christians to support the excess.
On the note of labor, I forgot about this one, but this is one of the few things in the Bible that's quoted by communists. The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat.
Yep. And that has to do with widows being supported, but yes.
Yes. I completely forgot about that one.
So that's a crack. What else, Sebastian? What else is there that does not align with communism?
The fact that God, to me, what seals the deal is that God blesses people with the means of production, like with private property. He made Abraham extraordinarily rich. He was probably like Jeff Bezos of the ancient world, had his own private army of guards. He made Lot exponentially wealthier than what he was before, with private property, not just enough to sustain himself, but to make even more wealth through cattle and herds of animals. Those were the means of productions in the ancient world, not a factory. And then also in the New Testament, you see, I believe it's Lydia, who traded in purple cloth, the most expensive luxury good in the ancient world. She's a convert to Christianity, and nowhere is she told, you evil capitalist, you will burn in hell unless you sell all your stuff and give it to the poor.
Meet in her house, so it must have been a big house.
Yeah. She had a large house. Nowhere she criticized for being wealthy, and it seems that she used her wealth for the service and expansion of the church. And again, this is not just a very successful non-government organization. She is a trader of purple cloth, which is really, really, really expensive. in the ancient world. And then you have the letter to Philemon. Talk about slavery and how Christianity deals with slavery. I don't think we have time to get into this episode, maybe for a future episode. But Paul doesn't tell Philemon, in addition to welcoming Onesimus as a fellow brother instead of just as a slave, he doesn't tell him, sell your mansion and sell the rest of your property, you wicked capitalist, you oppressor of the poor. No. He says, in fact, I've stayed in your house many times. So even Paul, an apostle, has enjoyed the luxuries of life. He says, I've had my fill. I have been in struggling times, and I've also had my share of plenty. So an apostle of Christ doesn't criticize people for being wealthy. So being wealthy, it seems to not be the evil in itself, according to the New Testament. It's what you do with the wealth that's either righteous or evil.
And some would say, yes, you quote some of the Old Testament, you quote some of the New, but the Old Testament really does not count anymore because it's a new kingdom in Christ. There's new laws, and so I don't care if God was blessing Job or Abraham or King David or whoever with material wealth, because in the New Testament it's a new day. Jesus was a pauper, and James says that the rich, we should not be deceived and give special preference to the rich, and that don't you know that the rich are oppressing us? And so we're all aboard the new class warfare. Jesus has brought into the collective conscience this idea of different classes, and so some of the disciples and writers of Scripture are carrying it out. And so yes, God might have operated before the Messiah in a certain way, but now with the Messiah we're operating in the new way. And whether we call it Marxism or whatever, it's certainly a skewing of riches and a communal living. I would point to Jesus' own parables, and these parables are from Jesus' mouth, from Jesus' invention, and therefore an idealized way of Jesus' seeing of the world, i.e. God's seeing of the world. A very famous parable, the parable of the talents, is where we get our word for talent for, talents being a measure of gold, a large measure of gold, where Jesus talks about a master, God, that's the parable is the master's God, and he is leaving for a long trip. He leaves his servants with certain talents, some money, and he gives them unequal measures based on their ability. So already he is not giving everybody equivalent to their need. In fact, probably the most capable servant needs the least talents because he's the most capable. Yep. He can make more money on his own. He doesn't need the full talents, but he gives the most capable servant 5 talents. The mid-capable servant 2 talents, and the least capable servant 1 talent. So already there's major inequality here, and a talent is a lot of gold. And then these men go and invest the talents, exploiting their wealth, clearly using the means of production that don't belong to them to make more wealth. And the richest servant makes the most. He doubles his money, so he makes 5. The second richest servant doubles his money and makes 2, so 4 in total. And then the least rich servant sits on the wealth, maybe righteously in Marxism, doesn't exploit this benefit he's gotten from his master. He sits in the wealth and just subsists himself, lives off his master's household and doesn't do anything. And when the master returns, so when God returns, how does he judge these servants? Very famously, he rewards the first 2. It doesn't matter how much they got. They both get the same reward. You've been faithful with a little, you've been faithful with much. Come and enjoy your master's company. The least loved servant, the hated servant, is the one who just sat on the wealth. So the one that did not exploit the wealth God gave him, and he did not get a fair cut here. He got the least cut. Gets not only his talent taken away from him and given to the one with the most, by the way, so increasing the inequality in the scenario. The master, God, takes away the wealth of that person and gives it to the one with the most. He even says, for those who have, more will be given to them, and those who do not have, even what they have will be taken away from them. It's directly from Jesus, a learning you're supposed to glean from this parable. The man is also thrown out to the outer darkness, to hell. And so the Marxist, in this case, if Marx was given this and was being ideologically consistent, he would have sat on his wealth. He wouldn't want to have exploited it. Maybe he would have given it away. Would have been thrown into hell. So it is actually a hellacious philosophy to say that inequality is bad, or that you should sit on wealth and not exploit it. The exploitation of wealth is commended by Jesus Christ himself in parable. And again, when not all parables are perfect in that you can't take every aspect of a parable as gospel truth, because the parable is trying to point towards a particular truth, and so like little details sometimes are not what we should be taking away from the parable. But Jesus has an aside in the parable that says, for those who have, more will be given to them, and for those who do not have, even what they have will be taken away from them. And clearly the point of this whole parable is to invest the things that God has given you. And so all that to say, the New Testament absolutely eschews the thought of exploiting what God has given you as being bad. The reverse. If you don't exploit what God gives you, it is evil, worthy of hell.
Yeah, I find just ironic how it uses words that our Marxist friends might despise: interest, deposit money, invest.
Mm-hmm.
Those sound like capitalism.
Yes, or I mean, whatever you define capitalism as, but it's definitely not Marxism.
Yeah. Yep. God rewards people as he sees fit. Oh, and another. See, this is perhaps where we're already at different wavelengths. Because Marx assumed a materialistic world in which religion was, maybe not a fantasy, but maybe some fictitious thing for people to cope with. What you make, you truly deserve to have. What you produce, it rightfully belongs to you. Whereas as Christians, we should understand, like Job, like, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job made a lot of money during his life, and yet it just poof went up in smoke because Satan was testing him. And he had to, I hope I'm ever as wise and serene as him. I'll probably be pulling out my hair in road rage if something like that happens to me. To understand that all the things that you have in this life are blessings from God. If you have a comfortable life, a house, technology, good health, good food available to you, it's not because you deserve by your own personal merit to have it. It's because God has deigned it in his wisdom to grant it to you. And he even does it in the Proverbs we read. He even does that to wicked people. And he has his purposes. A purpose that he has explained himself is that through the wisdom literature, he sometimes makes wicked people really rich so that after they die, that wealth gets then passed on to people who actually deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
That may sound strange to us, but that's just how God has chosen to operate as revealed by himself. That already goes against, as you can see, Marxism in its purest form.
Yeah, I mean, it does make Proverbs is totally opposed to Marxism. Proverbs talks about the righteous being rewarded with wealth and the wicked being rewarded with poverty. And that, like you said, even if there are wicked people who gain wealth, that their wealth is ultimately stored up for the righteous one day. And so that the entirety of Proverbs is very money focused, so like 30% money Proverbs. And it absolutely is in opposition to Marxism. And so that alone should say that Marxism is not a thing compatible with Christianity. However, again, I understand that some people say Proverbs is not authoritative, and also it's the Old Testament. So that's why we went with the New. I think what's interesting here, if we're going Old Testament and we're going Solomon Proverbs, is that the idea of I'm going to say the wrong thing, materialist. The Marxists are materialist, that they believe that the ultimate sufferings in life are because of lack of material. And therefore, the ultimate good in life is to have an abundance of material. While, I agree, like good, as the Proverbs would say, you're rewarded with wealth, rewarded with goods for righteous behavior, and everybody wants goods. That will not solve all your problems. Very famously said in Ecclesiastes by the same writer of Proverbs, Solomon, that you could have the most wealth, the most freedom of ability to do things too. So not even just like pure money, but also the freedom of ability to do things, gain as many wives as you want, do whatever you want all day long, and still it does not satisfy. And so the utopia of Marxism, even if we were able to get there, which it looks like you were not able to get there, even if you were able to get there where you can do whatever you want, you can fly to the moon in a day, you can choose to be a painter one day and a pro athlete the next, you won't be satisfied, because life is more than just the material. And in addition, because God is the creator of man, equalizing the material will not equalize society. Even 1,000 generations from now, if everybody is always given the exact same materials, the exact same wealth, the exact same opportunities to do things, there will be some who are better than others. They're more efficient, they're more righteous than others, and there will always be, until heaven. And even in heaven, I believe that differences in ability will exist. But here, before heaven, there will be the unrighteous, the wicked, who choose to squander the things that they're given on purpose. And that will always exist because of the nature of sin and because of God's creation. Like, even if we take away the wickedness, even if wickedness is done away with, some people are more talented than others in doing things. Some have 5 talents and some have 2. So it's not a knock on the 2-talent person, but some have 5. Some are way better at making things than others. And so they will always have more. And that's a God-given reality. So to believe in Marxism is to deny God, is to say, I do not believe God when he says that the righteous are gifted with riches. I do not believe God when he says some are 5-talent people and some are 2-talent people. I do not believe God when he says, through Solomon, that riches don't satisfy. And in this way, ironically, Marxism, which is all about hating the rich and living humbly and like everybody shares the same pot and being selfless, is simultaneously more loving of riches than Christianity, i.e. it idolizes being rich. It idolizes living to be able to do whatever you want and like living with enough material that you never have to worry about material, way more than God ever does. And then at the same time, it demands riches, because it demands a certain level of poverty line for everybody, that you can't fall below this line. It's a human right to own whatever. The poverty line keeps increasing in Marxist minds. You need high-speed internet and a car and a 2,000 square foot house and running water and like, you know, everything, right? The list of needs keeps increasing as human society increases. But God, like you were mentioning, Sebastian, says, even what you have could be taken away from you. He doesn't owe you anything. He didn't owe Job anything. He took it all away. He let Satan take everything that Job had away, including family. Lives were taken away from Job, let alone all of his goods. So we are not owed a basic level. So Marxism is simultaneously more greedy and aspiring of wealth. Like it values wealth and idolizes wealth way more, and it demands more wealth than Christianity does.
Mm-hmm. And in his sovereignty, God decided to take that away and let the Soviet Union collapse for mismanagement, but you know, and some factors of going to wars it shouldn't have. But God is sovereign over nations and their outcome.
Yeah, and I think it's probably overplayed, which is why we haven't decided to discuss it here. But when you go against God, it does not work. And so the closer you get to God's law, the more you can sustain a broken system. And so do I believe that the United States, or capitalism as expressed by Adam Smith or whatever version of it people adhere to these days, is it perfect? No. Does it perfectly adhere to God's law? No. And so eventually it will fail, like every system does that is not God's law. But the closer you are to it, the longer things are going to go well for you, because that's the nature of God's law. He even says it. Honor your father and mother so that things go well for you. It's the only commandment with a promise, i.e. you could break other commandments and like that's not good. Eventually things will fail, but you'll probably go longer. You'll sustain yourself longer if you're at least adhering to honoring your father and mother. Marxism may have some good things. We discussed some of the things that are good about it. It clearly is trying to destroy the wicked's ability to accumulate wealth unrighteously. That's what it's trying to do. So in that way, there's righteousness there. And there's some righteousness in like individual autonomy and other things that eventually it valued in the Soviet Union and whatever else. However, it just doesn't work. It will not be a long-standing system because it rebels against God's creation. The hatred of biblical values will eventually lead you to destruction.
Amen.
You'll lose the very things you wanted. The whole point was to be a prosperous material society, and famously the Soviet Union was poor. Like you said, they got richer, the serfs got richer than they were, yes, but the whole world got incredibly rich post-World War II, and the Soviet Union, the least of those. And so they're famously a backward, materially poor country back then and to this day. And you can blame a lot of things, and surely there was a lot compounding there. Civil war does a work and a number on a country, so not to say there wasn't outside factors that caused the Soviet Union to be poor, but at the least you can say Marxism did not fix that, and they ended up being poor. The very thing they were trying to not be, they ended up being poor.
An ironic end.
It is. Any final thoughts, Sebastian, before we close?
We call everybody to not put their trust in human, whether it's human leaders, in the US especially, because leaders tend to go berserk, senile, and or crazy at some point. Leaders will disappoint you. Don't put your hope in human philosophies. Don't put your hope in political systems, because they will disappoint you. They will fail. They will cause suffering. And the worst case scenario, death of many people. Don't put your hope in that. Your only hope, and this is where we find our hope, is in the very creator of the universe, who distributes talents as he sees fit, not for his own amusement, but for the development of his saints, for the growth of his children, and also for writing a history of this wonderful history of redemption that started in the fall. Put your hope in that one God, Jesus Christ, who is working to redeem everything that's broken in this world. All that class struggle, sin, greed, pains of labor, because that was part of the curse. Working will be painful, and giving birth will be painful. All of that will be redeemed by this one God, Jesus Christ, who is the only means of achieving that redemption. And he is more than happy to welcome anybody who turns to him and repents. He'll welcome you into his family, and you'll get to spend eternity with him in his kingdom forever and ever.
Amen. And in Christ, we might have different abilities and blessings come heaven, but we all share one thing in common, and therefore we have everything in common, and that is Jesus Christ, because he's infinitely worth more than whatever shoes or cars or houses we end up with in heaven. The thing we all share is the greatest treasure, Christ, and so we are, in that way, equally rich. So it is the utopia of Marxism, except better. Thanks for listening. We have been The Found Cause. We've found our cause in serving the Lord Jesus Christ. I've been Michael the Man behind the machine, and to my virtual friend has been
Sebastian, the curator.
Thank you for listening. If you want to see the rest of our episodes, we sometimes do response videos every other week. We ought to do a response video where we talk about something culturally relevant, and then every other week we do something deeper dive, whether it's this or something explicitly biblical. We'll go through a book of the Bible. If you want to catch those episodes, you got to find us on facebook.com/foundcause. We're also on YouTube, where I encourage you to comment or subscribe or downvote or upvote, whatever you felt about the episode. Please comment, because I love comments. We also are on iTunes and Spotify and wherever else you might find your podcast. So until next time, where we talk about something completely different, I promise. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.